The Fear of Flying by Erica Jong. In The Fear of Flying by Erica Jong, major themes throughout the book directly correlate with fragments of the author's life. The book was published in 1973, and this book was set in the time period in which it was written. Before we can go any further, some of the main characters needs to be introduced. Isadora Wing, the protagonist of the story, finds herself on a journey, mostly to find a zipless, well, the next word's censored, so we'll just call it ZF. Through the subsection, she goes on a wild, provocative, and almost comical journey as she explores her old and new experiences. Some of the things about Isadora Wing that stick out is that she is a writer. Now, in being a writer, she writes about a lot of things that are sexually promiscuous and involve a lot of herself into the roles, and sometimes her friends and family throughout the story. This gets her in trouble later, but we'll go on with that at a different time. She is currently married to Bennett Wing, and she is not happy in this relationship. This is what persuades her to go look for the ZF. Another important thing to note about Isadora Wing, even though it's not necessarily a huge concept, is that she is Jewish, and this becomes a really big concept further on in the book. She is of Jewish descent, but she is not actually religious in that way, which is one of the conflicts that she experiences within herself. Our next two characters are Bennett Wing, who is the husband of Isadora, and Adrian Goodlove, which is the ZF. Bennett Wing is a psychoanalyst and is also the current husband of Isadora Wing. Isadora describes him as a very boring man. Now, she's not necessarily talking about conversation, she's actually talking about their sex life. And even though he's great in bed, he's really not passionate. He's actually said to be very cold. And so this is actually kind of what makes her start to look for a zipless, ZF. So, Bennett Wing also plays an important role in being a contrast character to Adrian Goodlove, who is the ZF. By doing this, Bennett is actually showing what Isadora thinks she wants versus what maybe that she needs, or maybe how her wants have changed progressively over the time span of her first love, her first husband, to now, and at the end of the book. Adrian Goodlove is a very interesting character for a lot of different reasons. One of the first things that we know about Adrian Goodlove, and which I've mentioned many times before this, is that he is the ZF of the story. Now, she meets Adrian Goodlove, Isadora does, whenever her and her husband are going to a conference over in Germany. Now, this conference is important because it's for his work, but it's also important because that's where she meets a lot of other psychoanalysts, which she has gone to over the course of her life for different reasons. She has been through many traumatic experiences of her own in different ways, and her family situation is really weird. So she ends up going to a lot of psychoanalysts to try to work through some of these problems. A lot of the psychoanalysts she's not very fond of, however, there are some that she does like. However, getting back to Adrian Goodlove, since she meets him at the conference, she actually also meets him in a very weird way. She is getting kind of testy with some of the people there with security and trying to get through. He comes up to her and actually grabs her backside and squeezes her butt. Now, today we would not see this as a romantic gesture at all. However, Isadora actually sees this as a really thrilling moment, especially after dealing with boring Bennett for so long. She sees this as a very romantic gesture, and since she has been imagining and romanticizing this ZF, this no strings attached relationship, Adrian strikes her as somebody who is immediately somebody who would be passionate, and she kind of falls in love with him. Not our version of love, but definitely a version of love. A version of love that she is describing. I put some other information such as that he is bi. This is not necessarily determined in the book, but it is definitely hinted at in a bunch of different places. One of the most obvious places is when there's a threesome between Bennett, Isadora, and Adrian. Now, this is a really awkward time, and it is never spoken of after the incident again, which is actually kind of hilarious. This really just shows how he is free-spirited and wild, and he's everything that Bennett is not. So it's basically everything that Isadora is looking for at this point in her journey. The next person that we're going to take a look at is Brian, aka Jesus. He was actually Isadora's first husband. So as I've said, Brian was Isadora Wing's first husband. He is brought up usually in conversations when she is talking to Adrian Goodlove. Later on when they run off together, Brian is a big part of what she talks about, and she goes into some of the trauma that has kind of come over with her from her first marriage. So since they were married first, they actually met in college. He was considered a very odd person, but that's one of the things that actually attracted Isadora. She has always been apparently attracted to very odd men with really weird qualities, and Brian was no exception to this. A lot of his classmates would describe him as weird, and later on when he had a psychic break, a lot of them would come to expect it. He did eventually go insane later on in their marriage. It was quite early on. It was just a few years in. It started off kind of slow, and it gradually got worse and worse. It started off with like small little things like missing work, and then it became a full-blown, he turned into Jesus. He actually tried to walk on water in the park. Since Isadora's in-laws, his parents, didn't like her, they blamed her as much as he blamed her for this eventual meltdown. He ended up going to an insane asylum after he tried to kill her, which is a really big event for Isadora, as you could imagine. Isadora took this mental break really well for somebody who was nearly choked to death. So she actually, with his parents' help, got him into a mental institution and tried to work with him and tried to help him get better. However, by this point he had degraded so much, and his parents, her in-laws, have influenced him so much that he cannot stand her, and he blames her for everything that is going on. He blames her for not believing in him, not believing he's the next Messiah. This actually plays directly in with the fact that she is Jewish, which I think is a very interesting connection that is often overlooked with Brian. So the fact that he went insane and called himself Jesus, and that she was of Jewish descent, but not necessarily of religion, really can speak volumes to about who Brian was and how he brought out that aspect of her personality. Isadora's mother, Jude, also played a significant role in Isadora's life, arguably more than many other characters, probably the most right under Bennett and Adrian in this particular story. Her mother was a very unique individual. She hated ordinary. It was like a cuss word to her almost. And Isadora described it as one of her greatest insults. She also kind of complains that her mother wasn't very ordinary. At times it was very annoying, and Isadora wanted nothing more than to just have a normal life with a normal mom that wouldn't dress so flamboyantly every time she went out. And it was all just a lot for Isadora at a young age, but she grew, and a lot of the aspects that her mother held to such a high standard, Isadora kind of takes those ideas upon herself as well. One thing that Isadora really takes away from her mother's teachings and the way that she was raised was that Jude was a very bitter woman, and she was very bitter because she used to write and to do art, and she was kind of taken advantage of. Her husband also was an artist at the same time she was, and he would actually do things, terrible things, like paint over her canvases when they ran out instead of going and buying new ones. So instead she turned to writing, and this probably might have gone somewhere had she not have had children, or so she says. So basically, Jude is just complaining all the time, as Isadora is a child, about how if she wouldn't have had kids, that she would have become something great. Obviously, this is going to influence the child, the one that you're complaining to and about. Through this, Jude is portrayed as a very self-absorbed person, and this philosophy of how children can ruin this idea and concept of striving for greatness, and it just kind of halting the ability and halting the artistic expression that comes with having no children, having no responsibilities in that type of area. And even though Isadora does marry, she does put off marriage, and this becomes a huge point between her and her mother, and mostly her sisters, which I will go on about later. There are some other honorable mentions that should be included with the characters. They're not going to play as big of a part as Bennett or Adrian will in the story, but they are important to keep in mind. Pia is Isadora's longtime friend. She's one of the few female friends that we actually get to see any throughout the story very much. So I feel like she is important in that way. We do hear about some of their sexual adventures, or misadventures really, throughout a few small parts of the book. Charlie also is very important. He's brought up mostly in backflashes and anytime that she's really just thinking to herself. He is the ex-boyfriend. He was in between her divorce with her first husband, Brian, and then her current husband, Bennett. So he's an actual really nasty guy, and I don't mean that his attitude was bad. I mean, he was genuinely described in a very gross way, which was the weird aspect which Isadora somehow found really appealing. Again, she likes those really unique, odd, weird things in guys. So he's really more of the rebound. It doesn't end up working out because he's still in love and still writing letters to another woman, which he eventually leaves Isadora for, which is sad, but it's better that she left stinky Charlie anyway. Her sisters also play a part in her story. She has 3. Randy is the eldest sister, and she has 9 children, which is very important because her and Isadora usually end up fighting a lot about the need to have children. Isadora doesn't feel the need to have children, but Randy thinks it's vital to her happiness and basically to her womanhood. She has another sister, Lala, and she's younger than Isadora, so she's still a middle child, but she's a little bit younger. She actually has quintuplets, which is also an important part of the story, since she has kids, and she has so many at once, which is a really big deal. It's put in the papers, and Lala, she just makes a huge deal about it. Her youngest sister, Chloe, she actually married what Isadora called an import Jew, which means a Jew that's not exactly from their area, which she said would not exactly be the proper thing to do. She doesn't really go into a lot of detail why, but it is odd. She is the only sister to actually marry another person of a Jewish descent. The other 2 sisters married other types of either ethnicities or something to that effect. Her dad isn't really mentioned a lot. He makes a sly comment here or there, and then he sings an old song at one point, but he's not a huge factor in the story. He generally stays behind the scenes. Another important point to understand before we go into the themes is feminism. Feminism played a really important role when writing this book. Erica Jong mentions how a lot of what was going on in that time period really reflected and was reflected in the book. The last concept that should really be understood before going on to themes is whether or not the story is an autobiography. Now, Penguin Random House Corporation went and did an interview with Erica Jong and asked her if it bothered her that her book was often mistaken for a simple autobiography. And she responded saying, "But it was never a literal autobiography. though it had autobiographical elements. It's not unusual for a first novel to have such elements. Seeing as this isn't an autobiography, it is important to note that there are a lot of similarities between her work and her life, and some of these overlapping similarities actually cause friction between her and those around her, such as her friends and family, and I'll go on about that a little bit later. The second wave feminism that is used in the book is a lot different than feminism that we are more comfortable with and more knowledgeable about today. Second wave feminism began around the 60s to 70s era, and it really revolved around gaining rights and independence. Now, it wasn't necessarily inclusive, and it really more focused on upper middle class white women, and they were trying to rise above societal structures and trying to find an identity of self and trying to become more independent within themselves. You can see this a lot in the way that Isadora Wing is trying to really find herself, and she's described as of Jewish descent, but she's also very obviously middle class. She doesn't seem to be worrying about money. She doesn't seem to be worrying about a lot of the things that a poor woman in a smaller minority might be worrying about, such as an African American woman or maybe a Chinese woman or something to that effect. So it's definitely focusing more around that middle class more than it is on any other sort of minority problems. Some of the aspects in the book that are very similar is her college life. They went to the same college, both Isadora and Erica Jong. They both went to Columbia. They also both married their college sweetheart and ended up actually divorcing them. This leads us to our next point and the next topic, where autobiography and fiction really begin to mix. Erica Jong also enters a second marriage to a Chinese man, just like Isadora marries a Chinese man, Bennett. Erica Jong actually marries a man named Alan Jong. She also is a poet, just as Isadora Wing is in the story. Isadora actually quotes one of Erica Jong's poems. It's called The Man Under the Bed, which originally appeared in Fruits and Vegetables, which was written in 1971. Another group of poems that Erica Jong wrote later on was At the Edge of the Body in 1973. These were not included, but they do represent a lot of the things that Isadora Wing is going through as well. Both Isadora's poetry as well as Erica Jong's poetry explore female sexuality and the roles of women in contemporary society. Another aspect in this book to really pay attention to, and that really goes along with the autobiography, is the racism that is in the book. It is scattered around, so a lot of research hasn't really shown and hasn't really discussed certain concepts in the book, such as racism, but it is definitely there. One of the most obvious aspects of this is found in the chapter Arabs and Other Animals. This chapter is actually discussing Randy's husband, who is an Arab. Basically, this became a huge problem, obviously because the title of it, Arabs and Other Animals, was just chapter 14, and that in itself is such a racist comment. But mix that in with Erica Jong's real sister having a brother-in-law, and it really only makes the situation that much worse. It also doesn't help that in the book, the brother-in-law actually assaults and tries to sleep with or rape all of the other sisters of Randy. By including this in the book, Erica Jong, I don't know if she really thought this through, because as her sister put it, it was a terrible time, and by Erica Jong writing this, she was slandering her real world family by writing such terrible things. This obviously had a huge effect on Erica Jong as a writer, and choosing to include such a horrific scene in such a racist way about her actual family doesn't seem like the best move for a writer. But as I said, this was around second wave feminism, so we're not really focusing on minorities in this time, which isn't right, but it was that way at the time. Later on, feminism moves and is much more inclusive in third wave feminism, and now going into fourth wave feminism. But at this time, we still had a lot of racism. A lot of movements were still in the very beginning stages. Like I said, there are a lot of racist moments in the books. This is the most obvious one, and it should be noted that it did happen. It shouldn't just be pushed under the rug for all the feminist aspects in it. All of these concepts are now going to come together to bring us the themes of the overall novel. One of the first and most obvious themes that we can see is the search for self-discovery. The way that we see this is mostly through Isadora's thoughts and her final revelation about owning her own soul at the end. We can see this theme play out as she is jumping from man to man, and internally she knows that she's becoming dependent on these men by her own self, by her own logic and her line of reasoning, but she also has a hard time trying to stop this line of reasoning. A lot of this could be from the way she was raised to any of her other thoughts and her own terrible mishaps with men from the very beginning. But she does overcome this dependence, and by the end of the book she's become a very strong and independent woman, and she is actually waiting unknowingly by her husband, but she is actually waiting in his hotel room taking a bath, and the book ends with him opening the door for her to be sitting in the bathtub just washing up. So though we don't really get to know, we have this hope at the end that even if she can't work things out with Minute after running off with Adrian, that she is able to go on and capable of being an independent woman. The next really obvious theme is the ZF. The ZF was actually a coined phrase by Erica Jong, and originally the editor wanted to take it out. He said that it didn't make sense and that people were not going to be able to react to it because of that. Erica Jong protested this really fervently and said that she needed to coin the phrase because it did mean something. And this phrase has actually become quite popular, and it was especially in the years after its first release. This theme of finding a stranger and having a no strings attached type of relationship, just one and done sex, one night stand with absolutely no meaning to it, is really still used today in a lot of different ways. Not necessarily the same phrases used, not the same coinage, but the idea of it has definitely stuck with it. The last theme that really needs to be concentrated on is the idea of who is in control. This theme comes up a lot, and it's more or less developed than the others in some ways. It is more talked about especially near the end, and it comes up more indirectly than the others, but I do feel like it still is a major theme. This theme comes up a lot as Isadora struggles to kind of break free and become more independent and not rely so much on the men in her life, which has happened so frequently. She has relied on her first husband, Brian, who has completely lost his mind, has gone insane, believes that he is Jesus, and then she goes on to Bennett, and she completely relies on Bennett, is dependent on him. And although Bennett is more stable than Brian, there's still something missing in her relationship since she can't be independent within herself, and since she is struggling with so much deep-rooted anxiety. And Adrian just up and abandons her at the end of the book. And even though he's had so much sway over her life, she now finds herself again helpless in a very dependent state, wondering whether she should try to go back to Bennett or her family, or where she should go, because she is not in control at this point. She hasn't been in control, but now she can be. She learns to take her own self and push forward and go through with her own thoughts and ideas in an almost comical way, especially at the end when she starts her period and has to make a makeshift diaper as she climbs the stairs trying to get to a bathroom, trying to get a pad. It's quite comical, and even she finds it comical. And it's through this absurdity that she really finds that she can be in control of her own life and that she can do the things without being dependent on men. Even though she does go back to Bennett, she doesn't expect him to necessarily forgive her, and she's okay with his choices. If he doesn't take her back, then she's now okay because she's in control of her life, and she's okay with being independent because she is now the one in control. In summary, Erica Jong wrote a really interesting narrative about a woman who was trying to come up and find herself. And a quote that really helps describe her travels on writing this book are found in this: "No one ever found wisdom without also being a fool. Writers, alas, have to be fools in public, while the rest of the human race can cover its tracks." So I feel like this is really important because Erica Jong has obviously made mistakes in her book. She has been racist. Her second wave feminism isn't very inclusive, isn't very intersectional. It really doesn't cover a scope of problems. It only covers a very narrow range. But she has also put forth the effort to make her mark on history and to do what Isadora is basically trying to do, which is to find herself through her writings and through her independence. Which, at the end of the day, could you expect any more? These are the works cited in case you need to look up any more information on this novel.